After 25 years of marriage, my wife told me to leave our home because of a lie my stepdaughter created. She staged evidence, turned my wife against me, and thought she had won. But the gift I left behind would expose everything and change the family forever. Before we start the story, comment below and tell me where in the world you're watching from today. And if you enjoy stories like this, make sure to subscribe and turn on the bell icon so you don't miss the next one. My name is Patrick, and for 25 years I had been married to Margaret. We built our life step by step, beginning in a cramped apartment with secondhand furniture and moving into the home we eventually bought together. I worked long days on construction sites, and she worked part-time at a library, keeping our house warm and welcoming. We celebrated anniversaries in the backyard, planted trees that still grew tall along the fence, and filled the rooms with memories. I thought nothing could shake the bond we shared. But her daughter, Claire, from her first marriage, had always been a quiet storm in the background of our life. I raised Claire since she was a teenager, paid her tuition, and even covered her debts when she struggled. I never asked for much in return, only a little respect. Over time, however, her looks toward me became colder, her comments sharper, as though she was waiting for a chance to cut me down. It began with little remarks. Claire would sit with Margaret and whisper about how I handled the bills, about how men often keep secrets when it comes to money. Margaret would laugh it off at first, but then she started asking me twice about payments I had already made, or double-checking the mail before I opened it. It hurt, but I told myself it was just her daughter stirring things out of habit. I never thought it would grow into something more dangerous. But one Sunday evening, during what was supposed to be a peaceful family dinner, Claire made her move. She excused herself from the table, saying she had forgotten her phone in the study. A few minutes later, she came back, holding a thick manila folder in her hands. Her voice trembled with fake shock as she said, "I found this in Patrick's desk." She opened the folder and spread out papers across the table, bank transfer slips, a supposed copy of Margaret's will with fresh adjustments, signatures that looked like mine. It was written as if I had been stealing from Margaret, shifting money into my own accounts, and trying to take what was meant for Claire one day. Margaret's hand shook as she turned each page. When her eyes met mine, there was no warmth left, only a cold disbelief I had never seen in her face before. "Pack your things," she said in a voice that cut through me. "I want you out tonight." I stood without a word and went upstairs. As I folded my clothes into a suitcase, memories rose with every shirt and book, birthdays, anniversaries, nights when Margaret and I had fallen asleep laughing. I packed them all away in silence, my chest hollow. I did not argue. I did not explain. There was no room for words when her trust had already been poisoned. But before I left, my eyes fell on the mantel in the living room. Next to a framed photo of our wedding day sat a small silver-wrapped frame I had placed there 3 days earlier. Margaret thought it was a simple anniversary gift. She didn't know that inside it was something more, something that would soon reveal who had truly been lying. I carried my suitcase down the stairs, every step heavier than the last. Margaret sat stiffly at the table, the folder still spread open before her. Claire stood just behind her mother's chair, her hand resting lightly on Margaret's shoulder, as though she were the one offering comfort. The sight made my stomach twist, but I kept my face calm. Margaret did not look at me as I passed. It was as if I was already a stranger in my own house. I set the suitcase by the door, slipped on my coat, and for a moment, I almost spoke. I almost begged her to look at me, to remember the years we had fought through hardships side by side. But her eyes stayed on those forged papers, and her silence told me everything. Claire smirked faintly when she thought her mother couldn't see, and that was when I knew arguing would only make me look guilty. I opened the door and stepped out into the night air. The house behind me glowed warm with light, but to me it no longer felt like home. The cold air steadied me. I loaded the suitcase into my car and sat behind the wheel, staring at the windows I had washed every spring and the roof I had patched with my own hands. Memories pressed against me, but I forced them down. I turned the key, but before I drove away, I let my eyes wander back to the mantel through the living room window. The silver-wrapped frame was still sitting there, waiting. Claire thought she had won. Margaret thought I was broken. But neither of them had any idea that I had been preparing for this moment longer than they knew. That small frame was more than a gift. It was the truth, hidden in plain sight, and it was only a matter of time before it spoke louder than any accusation. I drove aimlessly for a while, the streets blurring past as my thoughts grew heavier. I stopped at a small roadside motel on the edge of town, the kind of place with buzzing neon and thin curtains. Inside the room, I sat on the edge of the bed with my suitcase still closed at my feet. The silence pressed in on me, broken only by the hum of the air conditioner. I could still see Margaret's face in my mind, eyes narrowed, lips pressed thin, the look of a woman who had already judged me guilty. I thought of the nights we had spent planning for our future, the sacrifices we had both made, and how quickly it had all been turned upside down. Claire had poisoned her mother against me with one staged performance, and now I was the villain. Home. But beneath the hurt, a colder determination settled inside me. I had spent too many years working with my hands, fixing what others thought was broken, to accept defeat so easily. Claire thought she was clever planting those papers, but she had forgotten one thing. I had noticed her snooping in the study days before the dinner. She had no idea that the lamp on my desk wasn't just for light. I had wired it with a small recorder weeks ago after finding drawers disturbed more than once. Every motion, every late-night visit to that desk had been captured. And when I wrapped that silver frame for Margaret, I had tucked something inside it that would make sure the truth couldn't be hidden. Sitting in that motel room, I no longer felt like a man who had lost everything. I felt like a man waiting for a storm I had already prepared for. The night in that motel felt longer than any I had ever lived through. I lay on the stiff mattress, staring at the cracks in the ceiling, while my mind replayed every detail of the dinner over and over again. The way Claire had walked into the study so casually as if she had just remembered something. The way she came back with that folder already opened, holding it like a prize she had been waiting to collect. And Margaret, her hands shaking as she looked at the papers, her lips pressing into that hard line that used to only appear when bills piled too high or when the car broke down at the worst time. But this time, it wasn't frustration. It was judgment. It was disgust. That expression etched into her face as she looked at me hurt worse than anything. I had been a husband who carried her through sickness, who worked double shifts so she could reduce her hours and focus on Claire's schooling. I remembered the Christmas when money was so tight, I built Claire's present in the garage with scraps of wood rather than buy something new. She had smiled that morning and hugged me, and I thought maybe she saw me as more than just her mother's husband. But years had changed her. What used to be gratitude turned into suspicion, and what started as small comments about her father's inheritance had grown into a steady drip of poison in Margaret's ear. Still, I had not been blind. For months I had noticed drawers left slightly open, papers shuffled out of place. At first I thought Margaret had been organizing, but then I caught a glimpse of Claire in the study late one night, rifling through things with the quiet speed of someone who knew she didn't belong there. That was when I made my decision. I bought a new desk lamp, nothing fancy, just brushed metal with a dimmer switch. But inside I had tucked a small recorder that activated with movement. Every time the desk drawer opened, it captured a clip. Every time Claire printed something or swapped papers, it stored it. I didn't tell Margaret because I didn't want her to think I was paranoid, but deep down, I knew something was coming. When I wrapped the silver frame and placed it on the mantel, I made it look like a thoughtful gift for Margaret, an updated photo of us from our 25th anniversary. But hidden inside the back panel was a small memory card and a folded letter. The card held days' worth of recordings from the study, and the letter explained exactly what I suspected. It was my way of giving her the truth, even if she wasn't ready to hear it in that moment. That frame was my last line of defense, the final wall between me and the ruin Claire wanted for me. As I sat in that motel room, the hum of the old air conditioner filling the silence, I realized something important. I was no longer just waiting to see if Margaret would discover the truth. I was waiting for Claire to trap herself. The more she thought she had won, the more careless she would become. And when Margaret finally opened that frame, every lie, every whispered accusation, every forged document would collapse around Claire like a house built on sand. The following morning, I woke in that dim motel room with a heavy weight pressing on my chest. It wasn't just the ache of being pushed out of my own home. It was the memory of Margaret's eyes, the way they had turned cold in an instant. That look kept cutting into me, sharper than any knife. I sat by the small desk in the corner of the room, sipping bitter motel coffee, and thought about the years I had given her. I had been there through everything. The nights when she cried over her first husband's passing, the endless worry about bills when Claire was in college, the evenings when I came home bone-tired but still carried her to bed after her surgery. 25 years of building trust, brick by brick, and all it took was one staged performance from Claire to tear it all down. But as much as the betrayal stung, my mind kept drifting back to that silver frame. It sat in plain sight on the mantel, wrapped neatly with a ribbon Margaret herself had once tied around Claire's birthday gifts. I knew she wouldn't open it right away. Margaret was the kind of woman who saved gifts for special moments. She would probably leave it there for days, maybe even weeks, letting it catch her eye as a reminder of what she thought I had left behind. What she didn't know was that the truth was resting inside, waiting for the right time to speak. The recorder in the desk lamp had captured more than enough. Claire sneaking into the study late at night, pulling gloves from her pocket before touching anything. The faint whir of the printer as she created those fake transfers and that forged will adjustment. Even her voice, muttering to herself as she copied my signature, practicing the strokes under her breath. The evidence wasn't only solid, it was undeniable. When Margaret finally watched those recordings, there would be no mistaking who had betrayed whom. Still, doubt gnawed at me. What if Margaret refused to look? What if Claire convinced her to throw the frame away before it was ever opened? I knew how persuasive Claire could be when she set her mind to something. She had a way of twisting words until they sounded like the truth. I had seen it before when she convinced Margaret to cover her debts from that failed boutique business, insisting she only needed one more chance. Margaret had drained her savings to help, and Claire had walked away without a hint of shame. I looked around the small motel room, the peeling wallpaper, the hum of the old refrigerator, the faded curtains, and for the first time in my life, I felt like an exile. My house, the place I had spent decades repairing and protecting, was no longer mine. My wife, the woman I had once believed would stand by me through anything, had chosen to believe her daughter over me. And yet, even in that hollow space, I felt a strange kind of calm, because I knew something they didn't. I knew the truth was already planted right inside the home that no longer welcomed me. And when it came out, it wouldn't just clear my name. It would change everything Claire thought she had gained. So I waited. I packed what little I had into the motel drawers and kept my phone close, knowing it was only a matter of time before the silence would break and the storm I had prepared for would finally arrive. The days that followed felt like walking through a fog. I went about the simplest routines, buying cheap breakfasts from the diner across the street, sitting by the motel window watching cars roll by, trying to sleep through the long hours of night. But all the while my mind stayed locked on that house and the silver frame resting on the mantel. I wondered if Margaret passed it each morning, glancing at it while she made her tea. Did she think of me when she saw it? Or had she hardened her heart so fully that it was just another object now, something that reminded her of a man she believed had betrayed her. That thought twisted in my gut, but I held on to one truth. Margaret was not a cruel woman. She was careful, she was cautious, and in her quiet hours, curiosity would win. At some point, she would open it. The more I sat in that motel room, the clearer the timeline became in my head. Claire had struck during dinner because she wanted Margaret's reaction immediate and sharp. She had wanted me out of that house quickly, before I could defend myself, before Margaret could ask questions. And she succeeded, too easily. But I also knew Claire well enough to predict what would follow. She would press Margaret to cut ties with me completely. She would encourage her to call a lawyer, to lock away finances, to rewrite wills. That was how Claire worked, swift, sharp, and ruthless. But in her rush to claim victory, she had left too many fingerprints on her own ski house. I parked 2 blocks away and walked past slowly, blending in with neighbors out for errands. From the sidewalk, I saw the curtains drawn in the front window, the faint glow of the kitchen light inside. The frame was still there, a silver shape against the pale mantel. It was untouched. Relief and frustration tangled in me. It was there, safe, holding the truth, but unopened, like a locked door between me and the life I had lost. That night, back in the motel, I lay awake, thinking of Margaret. She had always been a woman of reason. I remembered her, sorting bills at the kitchen table, double-checking each line, making sure nothing slipped past her. She hated deception, even in small things. If Claire had simply accused me without evidence, Margaret would never have believed it. That was why the forged documents had been so dangerous. They gave Claire just enough to poison her mother's trust. But if Margaret had believed papers, then surely she would believe video, audio, things no one could fake so easily. The question was, when would she see it? I knew it might take days, maybe even weeks, but I also knew Margaret's habits. She was the kind of person who could not leave a wrapped gift unopened forever. One evening, when the house was quiet, when Claire had left to meet her friends or sleep at her apartment, Margaret would reach for that frame. She would peel back the paper, curious, perhaps even missing me just enough to want to see what I had left behind, and when she did, she wouldn't just see a photograph. She would find the letter, folded carefully inside along with the small memory card that would change everything. So, I forced myself to wait. I ate my meals in silence, took walks around the cracked sidewalks near the motel, and sat by the phone every night, expecting it to ring. Because I knew that once Margaret saw the truth, the call would come. And when it did, the lies that had driven me out of my own home would begin to collapse, piece by piece, until the truth stood alone. On the 4th evening in that motel, I finally heard my phone ring. The sound startled me. It had been nothing but silence since I left. My chest tightened as I saw Margaret's name glowing on the screen. For a moment, I almost didn't answer. I was afraid of what I might hear, afraid she would only repeat her command to stay gone. But something in me told me this was different. Her call came late, just after 9, a time she usually spent reading or tidying the house before bed. I pressed the phone to my ear, and at first she said nothing. I could hear her breathing, unsteady, as though words were trapped in her throat. Finally, her voice broke through, low and trembling. "Patrick, what did you leave in that frame?" I closed my eyes, relief washing over me like a wave. She had opened it. She had finally looked. "You saw it then," I said, my voice steady though my hands shook. "Everything you need to know is in there." There was another silence. Then a sound I hadn't expected. Margaret, crying. "I watched it all," she whispered. "I saw Claire. The gloves, the papers, her voice. Oh God, I saw it all." She paused to catch her breath, and I could hear the weight of betrayal pressing on her. "How could she do this? How could my own daughter?" Her words trailed off, swallowed by sobs that carried years of love and trust breaking apart. I let her cry, but inside me something heavy began to lift. She knew the truth now. She had seen with her own eyes the same things I had feared for months. "I never wanted to hurt you," I said softly. That's why I didn't shout when she accused me. That's why I left without a word. I knew you wouldn't believe me in that moment. I wanted you to see the truth for yourself, not hear it from my mouth. Margaret finally steadied her breathing. I don't know what to do, she admitted. She's my daughter. But she lied, Patrick. She lied so easily, so cruelly, and I believed her over you. Her voice cracked on the last words, and I heard the shame in her tone. I stayed quiet for a long moment, staring at the peeling paint on the motel wall before answering. The truth has a way of cutting through lies, Margaret. You don't have to decide everything tonight. But you know now who I am, and who she's become. She whispered that she wanted me to come home, but not immediately, not until she had faced Claire herself. She wanted to confront her daughter with the evidence, to hear her admit what she had done. I need to look her in the eye, Margaret said, her voice harder now, steadier. I need to hear her explain why she would destroy everything we built just to poison me against you. When the call ended, I sat there in the dim motel light with the phone still in my hand. For the first time since that night at the dinner table, I felt hope. But I also felt something else, dread, because I knew Claire. She wasn't the type to confess easily. She would fight, twist words, perhaps even turn her mother's anger back on me. But the evidence was there, undeniable, unshakable. And soon the same house that had watched me leave in silence would witness a very different kind of conversation, one that Claire could not control. I turned off the lamp beside the bed and lay back, my heart pounding with a strange mixture of fear and anticipation. The storm was about to break, and this time I wouldn't be the one standing in the rain. The next evening, Margaret called me again. Her voice sounded heavier, strained, like someone who had carried too much weight in too short a time. She told me that Claire had come by the house earlier, full of confidence, talking about next steps, as though my absence had already been carved into stone. Claire laughed in the kitchen, speaking about how easy it would be to move things forward now that I was gone. Margaret said she listened quietly, watching. Her daughter with new eyes, the recordings from the frame still fresh in her mind. Every word Claire spoke seemed like another knife turning. Finally, Margaret couldn't take it any longer. She walked into the study, took the memory card from the frame and placed it right on the desk. Then she called Claire in. Claire entered with that same smug look she had worn the night she accused me. Margaret told her to sit down. At first, Claire looked confused, then wary. Margaret pressed play on the laptop. The room filled with the sound of Claire's own footsteps at midnight, the faint rustle of gloves, the drawer sliding open. Her face drained of color as her own voice echoed back at her. Practice the signature slower, don't rush it. The recording showed her feeding papers into the printer, signing my name over and over, then placing the forged documents into the folder she would later discover. Margaret said she sat silently, her eyes locked on her daughter's face, while the truth unraveled itself in real time. Claire tried to laugh it off at first, claiming it was all a joke, that she was just testing me, trying to see if I had anything to hide. But Margaret wasn't buying it. She played the next clip, Claire whispering bitterly to herself about how unfair it was that I had so much influence in the house, how she deserved every penny, how she would never let her inheritance slip into my hands. Margaret said Claire's voice shook when she realized she had been caught on tape, her lies exposed from every angle. Still, she didn't confess. She turned angry instead, accusing Margaret of always taking my side, of choosing me over her. But Margaret didn't yell. She didn't cry this time either. She told me she sat with a cold calm, listening to every excuse, every twist of words, until Claire's voice finally cracked. That was when Margaret spoke, her words slow and steady. I believed you over the man who has stood by me for 25 years. I believed you, and you almost destroyed us. You didn't just lie about Patrick. You lied about the very foundation of this family. Claire's eyes filled with tears, but Margaret didn't move to comfort her. Instead, she pushed the folder of forged documents back across the desk. You wanted me to see these, she said, Now you'll live with the truth that I've seen everything." Margaret told me she ended the conversation by asking Claire to leave the house that night. She said it wasn't permanent. She couldn't bring herself to cut her daughter off completely, but she needed distance and she needed time. "I can't even look at her without hearing her voice on those recordings," she admitted to me over the phone. Her tone wavered, and I could tell the mother in her was still fighting the woman who had been betrayed. "Patrick," she whispered, "I don't know how to forgive her, but I do know I need you back." As she said those words, I sat in the same motel room where I had been banished just days before, and for the first time, I felt the ground shift beneath me. The truth was no longer hidden. It was standing in the open now, undeniable, and it had turned the tables completely. Claire had wanted me gone, but it was her who had been sent out into the night. And Margaret, the woman who had looked at me with disgust as I carried my suitcase out the door, was now asking me to return. I hung up the phone that night knowing one thing with certainty. The lies had collapsed, but the fallout was only just beginning. The following morning I checked out of the motel. The clerk at the desk barely looked up as I handed back the key, but I felt something different as I stepped outside. The weight on my shoulders wasn't as heavy as it had been the day I arrived. My car was packed, just the same, but my heart carried a new kind of certainty. Margaret had seen the truth with her own eyes. Claire had been exposed. Yet, even as I started the drive back toward the neighborhood I once called home, I couldn't shake the unease in my chest. Claire was stubborn, proud, and dangerous in her own way. She wouldn't just accept defeat. She would claw for another way to twist the story, another way to shift blame. When I reached our street, I slowed the car and parked 2 houses away, not wanting to announce myself too soon. I sat there for a moment, watching the familiar windows of my home. The curtains were open this time, the living room bathed in morning light. Through the glass, I could see Margaret moving slowly, her shoulders heavy, like someone who hadn't slept. The silver frame still sat on the mantel, no longer wrapped, the truth now fully exposed. It gave me a strange sense of pride and sorrow at once. Pride that my plan had worked, sorrow that it had been necessary at all. When I finally knocked on the door, it opened almost at once. Margaret stood there, her face lined with exhaustion, but her eyes softer than they had been the night she cast me out. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. She simply reached for my hand, held it tightly, and pulled me inside. The house smelled the same, coffee brewing in the kitchen, lavender from the candle she always lit in the mornings, but it felt different. The silence was thick, carrying the weight of betrayal and the fragile beginnings of repair. We sat at the dining table where it had all started, the place where Claire had spread out her lies like trophies. Margaret pushed the folder toward me, the forged papers now bent and smudged. "I can't believe I let myself trust these over you," she said, her voice breaking. "I looked at them and I doubted 25 years of everything we built." I shook my head. "Don't blame yourself. She knew exactly what she was doing. She made sure you saw those papers when your guard was down, when emotions were high." Margaret covered her face with her hands, her shoulders trembling. "She's my daughter, Patrick. I carried her, raised her, protected her. And she turned all of that against me. How do I forgive that? How do I move forward with her?" Her voice was full of a mother's torment, torn between love and betrayal. I sat quietly for a moment before answering. Maybe forgiveness isn't the question right now. Maybe it's about boundaries. She crossed a line that can't be ignored, and you have to make her live with that choice. Margaret lowered her hands, and I saw a new determination in her eyes. I told her last night to leave, and she did. She begged me to let her explain, to let her stay, but I couldn't. I told her until she admits what she did and accepts the consequences, she has no place under this roof. She paused, then looked at me with tears in her eyes. "I want you here, Patrick. I want us to fix what she almost destroyed. But I also know it won't be easy. She'll come back. She'll try again. And I need to know we'll be ready." I reached across the table and took her hand. "We will be. This house was built on more than lies. It was built on years of sacrifice, trust, and love. She can't erase that, not with papers, not with poison in your ear. For the first time since this ordeal began, Margaret managed a small smile. It was weak, tired, but real. She squeezed my hand and whispered, "Then let's start again, together." The weight between us wasn't gone, not by a long shot, but it had shifted. For the first time, it wasn't me standing alone in the storm, it was us, side by side. And while Claire had been pushed out of the house, her shadow still lingered. I knew she wasn't finished. Not yet. And that thought haunted me as I unpacked my suitcase in the same bedroom I had left in silence just days before. The first night back in the house felt strange, almost like walking into a place I no longer recognized. The bed was the same. The smell of Margaret's lavender candle still lingered in the hall. Yet I couldn't forget the sight of her face when she told me to leave. That memory clung to me like dust in the corners of the room. Margaret tried to settle back into routine. She made tea, turned on her favorite evening show, and folded laundry while humming under her breath. But I could feel her glancing at me every few minutes, as if making sure I was still there, as if I might vanish again. Trust doesn't snap back like a rubber band. It stretches, it thins, and sometimes it breaks. Ours was still intact, but it had been pulled nearly to breaking. The next morning, as I came downstairs, I noticed something out of place. A few envelopes had been slid under the front door in the night. Margaret bent to pick them up, her brow furrowed. When she opened the first, her dropped the letter as if it burned her fingers. The second envelope carried another message: "You'll regret choosing him over me." We looked at each other, both knowing exactly who had sent them. Claire's handwriting wasn't on the page, but the bitterness was hers. The cutout letters were a weak disguise, the kind of theatrics she thought would keep her safe. Margaret's face went pale, and for a moment I saw fear creep into her eyes. Not fear for herself, but for me, for what more her daughter might try. I picked up the papers and folded them calmly. "She's angry because she lost," I said. "She's trying to scare you, to shake you, so you'll take her side again. But the more desperate she gets, the more careless she'll become." Margaret sat at the table, pressing her palms against her eyes, whispering, "She's my daughter. How did it come to this?" I didn't answer because I didn't know. Families break in strange ways, sometimes quietly over years, sometimes in one sharp crack. Ours had broken in both. That evening, Margaret made a decision. She pulled out her phone and called the lawyer who had handled her will years ago. She told him she wanted to meet, not to disown her daughter, but to put protections in place. "I need to make sure she never has the chance to do this again," she explained. Her voice was steady now, no longer trembling. She asked the lawyer about securing the trust, about creating documents that left no room for manipulation. She wanted everything ironclad. I sat across from her at the table, listening, and for the first time in days, I felt a surge of pride. Margaret wasn't just believing me now, she was fighting with me. Still, I couldn't ignore the feeling crawling at the back of my mind. Claire had been caught, yes, but she hadn't admitted defeat. She had left the house with fire in her eyes, and now the letters proved she wasn't done. I knew she would try again, and the next attempt wouldn't be as sloppy as the first. As Margaret hung up the phone with the lawyer, she looked at me with quiet resolve. "We'll face her together," she said. I nodded, squeezing her hand. But deep down, I knew this was only the calm before the next storm. 2 days later, the storm we had been waiting for began to take shape. Margaret received a call from her close friend, a woman she had known since childhood. The friend spoke carefully, almost nervously, and told her that Claire had visited the night before. Over coffee, Claire had painted a picture of me as a manipulative man who had tricked Margaret into marrying me for money, who had slowly taken control of her life until she no longer saw clearly. "She said you're dangerous, Patrick," Margaret told me after she hung up, her voice trembling. "She's going to everyone we know, trying to ruin you in their eyes." I wasn't surprised. Claire had always cared deeply about appearances. If she couldn't convince her mother anymore, she would poison the community instead. Neighbors, friends, distant relatives, Anyone who would listen was now a target. By the end of the day, another friend called Margaret asking if it was true that I had forced her to sign over property. Each lie was spreading like cracks through glass, small at first but dangerous if left unchecked. Margaret sat at the kitchen table with her head in her hands, whispering, "She's destroying everything." I poured her a cup of tea and set it in front of her. "No," I said calmly, "she's destroying herself. Every lie she tells without proof only digs her hole deeper. People may whisper now, but whispers don't last when there's nothing to back them up. Still, I knew words alone wouldn't be enough. Claire was clever enough to fabricate more evidence, clever enough to create another scene as convincing as that dinner. That evening, I pulled the silver frame from the mantel again. Inside the hidden panel, I had left not only the memory card, but also a note Margaret hadn't read yet. It explained how to access a secure folder I had built on my computer, one that contained not only the recordings from the lamp, but years of organized financial records, bills, statements, and receipts. Everything was there, in black and white, proving where every dollar had gone, every decision we had made. "If she wants to paint me as a thief," I told Margaret, "we'll show them the truth in a way that can't be argued." Margaret touched the frame gently, as though it had become more than just a photo. It was no longer a symbol of suspicion and betrayal. It was a weapon of truth, a shield against the poison Claire kept spreading. "I want to believe that will be enough," she said quietly. "But she won't stop, Patrick. I know her. She'll come back, and she'll come harder." Her words proved true the very next night. Just after midnight, the sound of the doorbell shattered the quiet. Margaret and I both sat up in bed, startled. The chime rang again, louder this time, insistent. I went to the window and pulled back the curtain just enough to see. There, standing in the glow of the porch light, was Claire. Her hair was wild, her hands clutching a stack of papers against her chest. Even from behind the glass, I could see the fury etched into her face. She didn't knock politely. She jabbed the doorbell over and over like she was demanding entry into a fortress that no longer belonged to her. Margaret stood frozen at the top of the stairs, her hand pressed to her mouth. "Don't open it," she whispered. But I was already moving toward the door, not to let her in, but to look her in the eye through the glass. When she saw me, she slammed her palm against the door, her lips moving rapidly, her voice muffled but sharp. I couldn't hear every word, but I caught enough. "Liar. Thief. You ruined me." Her papers waved like weapons in her hands. Didn't open the door. I didn't shout. I simply stood there, calm, while she raged outside. And in that moment I realized something. She wasn't just trying to convince Margaret anymore. She was unraveling, her lies piling too high for her to carry. And if she wasn't careful, her next move would destroy her far more completely than she had ever hoped to destroy me. Margaret came down the stairs, her face pale, her voice shaking. "Patrick," she said, "she's losing control." And I nodded because I knew. The storm had finally broken. What came next would decide whether our family had anything left to salvage or if it would collapse once and for all. Claire didn't stop pounding on the door. She shouted now, her voice carrying into the quiet street. Lights flickered on in neighboring houses, blinds shifted, and I could feel curious eyes peeking out into the night. She was making a scene, and I knew that was part of her plan. If she couldn't convince her mother quietly, she would try to shame me publicly. Margaret clutched the banister, torn between fear and heartbreak, watching her daughter fall apart outside her own home. I put a hand on her arm and said firmly, "Stay here. Don't move." Then I walked to the door, unlocked it, and opened it just a crack, keeping the chain in place. Claire's eyes lit with rage when she saw me through the gap. "Let me in," she demanded, her voice hoarse. She shoved the stack of papers toward the opening. "You think you're smart, don't you? But I know what you're doing. I know what you're after." She tried to push the documents through, but they scattered onto the porch, pages fluttering in the night air. I glanced down and saw copies of statements, clumsily doctored, full of numbers that didn't add up, even at a glance. She had forged more evidence, desperate to keep her story alive. "Claire," I said, my voice low but steady, "go home." "Home?" she spat. "This is my home, not yours. You don't belong here. You never did." She slammed her fist against the door so hard the chain rattled. Margaret gasped from the stairs, tears streaming down her face. "Please stop, Claire," she cried out, but her daughter ignored her. Instead, Claire's voice rose even higher, screaming words meant to cut me down in front of anyone who might be listening outside. "He's a thief. He's a liar. He's been stealing from you for years, and you're too blind to see it." Her voice cracked, and for the first time I saw the fear in her eyes. It wasn't just anger fueling her, it was panic. She had been exposed, and the walls were closing in. I slowly shut the door, the chain still secure, and let her words echo uselessly against the wood. Margaret stood trembling, clutching the railing as if it were the only thing holding her upright. Through the small window beside the door, we watched Claire fall apart, shaking, her hair falling into her face. She cursed under her breath, then screamed at the sky as if the whole world had betrayed her. And then, almost as quickly as she had come, she stormed down the walkway, clutching the ruined documents to her chest. Her car screeched as she pulled away, tires squealing loud enough to wake half the neighborhood. Inside, the house was silent again, but the air was thick with the weight of what had just happened. Margaret turned to me, her eyes full of devastation. "That was my little girl," she whispered, her voice breaking. "That was my baby, and look at what she's become." She sank into a chair, her shoulders shaking, and for the first time since this all began, I saw her anger mix with grief. She would rather tear her life apart than admit she was wrong. I knelt beside her, taking her hands in mine. "Margaret," I said softly, "this isn't about me anymore. This is about her. She's unraveling because her lies can't hold up. And the more she fights, the more everyone will see the truth." Margaret wiped her tears, her face pale but resolute. "I can't let her back in this house. Not like this. Not until she owns what she's done." Her voice cracked, but it held firm. "If I let her keep poisoning everything, she'll destroy us both. I have to draw the line." In that moment, I realized something had shifted in Margaret. The doubt that Claire had planted in her heart was gone, burned away by the fire of her daughter's desperate fury. She had seen the truth, not just in the recordings, but with her own eyes at that door. And while the pain of a mother cutting ties with her child was heavy, Margaret knew it had to be done. The house was ours again, but the echo of Claire's scream still lingered in the walls, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. The days after Claire's midnight outburst passed in uneasy silence. Margaret and I tried to return to normal life. Morning coffee, quiet dinners, evenings spent on the porch, but the truth was, nothing felt normal anymore. Every creak of the floorboards, every sound of a car slowing outside the house, made us both tense. Margaret had told Claire she wasn't welcome back until she faced what she had done, but I knew my stepdaughter well enough to understand she wouldn't take those words as final. Claire wasn't the type to accept defeat. She was the type to circle, to wait, to plan. Neighbors began to whisper. At the grocery store, 2 women Margaret had known for years suddenly went quiet when they saw us walk down the aisle. At church, a man I had worked with on repairs wouldn't meet my eyes. Claire had been busy, her poison spreading even without proof. She had always been clever with words, skilled at twisting herself into the victim. Margaret held her head high, but I could see the toll it was taking. She moved slower, spoke less, and her eyes filled with tears. One afternoon, Margaret's phone buzzed with a message. She stared at the screen for a long time before handing it to me. It was from Claire. "You think you're safe because of those recordings, but everyone believes me. Soon you'll see who really belongs in that house." Margaret's hands trembled as she whispered, "She's trying to scare us." But the fear wasn't just for herself. It was for what her daughter might do next. That night, I went into the study where everything had begun. The desk lamp still sat where I had placed it months before. I opened the hidden compartment and checked the recordings again. Every clip was still there, every moment of proof untouched. I backed them up onto another drive and locked it in a metal box, just in case. I wasn't going to let Claire twist the truth again. If she wanted a war of words, I was ready with evidence that could burn through every lie she spoke. Margaret joined me in the study, her face pale but determined. "Patrick," she said softly, "I think it's time we make this public. Not just the two of us knowing the truth. Everyone needs to see what she did." At first, I hesitated. Releasing those recordings would humiliate Claire, expose her not just as a liar but as a calculating betrayer. It would strip away the last shield she had in the eyes of her friends and neighbors. It would mean the end of any chance Margaret had of quietly mending her relationship with her daughter. But Margaret was right. Claire had already dragged us into the court of public opinion. If we stayed silent, we would lose. I studied Margaret's face. There was pain there, yes, but also strength. "Are you sure you want this?" I asked. "Once it's out, there's no going back. Everyone will know." Margaret's eyes glistened, but she nodded firmly. "She chose this, Patrick. Not me, not you. She chose it when she planted those papers, when she stood in this room and lied to my face. She chose it again when she screamed in the street. If the truth ruins her, it's because she built her life on lies." That night, we copied the files to a new drive. Margaret drafted a letter explaining what had happened in her own words, simple and clear. We decided that if Claire continued her campaign of lies, we would send everything to the lawyer first, then to the people whose opinions she had poisoned. It wasn't revenge, it was survival. But even as we prepared, I couldn't shake the feeling gnawing at me. Claire had been reckless, yes, but she was also desperate. And desperate people didn't give up quietly. Somewhere out there she was waiting, watching, planning her next move. And deep down I knew that before this was over, Claire's final act would be the most dangerous of all. The following week crept by like a storm. Picked up small construction projects for neighbors who still trusted me, but beneath it all, the air in our home felt charged, heavy, as if the walls themselves were waiting for something to break. Nights were the hardest. Margaret would lie beside me, tossing and turning, her breathing uneven. Sometimes I would wake in the dark and hear her quietly sobbing into her pillow, the sound muffled but unmistakable. She was grieving not only for what had been done to us, but for her daughter, the little girl she had once read bedtime stories to, who had grown into a woman capable of such deceit. I never knew what to say in those moments, so I simply held her hand until the tears passed. But outside our home, Claire was busy. We began hearing stories from friends who avoided us in town. Margaret's cousin called one evening to say Claire had been spreading tales about me, claiming I had manipulated Margaret for years, that I had wormed my way into her finances until I controlled everything. She told people I had a violent temper, that she had seen bruises on her mother's arms from accidents that never happened. Lies, piled on lies, and though most who truly knew us didn't believe them, the whispers spread. You can defend yourself once, maybe twice, but when 100 little rumors float around, they begin to take on a life of their own. Margaret grew quieter each day. At dinner one night, she pushed her food around the plate and finally whispered, "What if people never look at us the same again?" Her voice was thick with despair. What if she's poisoned everything beyond repair? I reached across the table, taking her hand firmly. The truth has weight, Margaret. Lies float, they scatter. But the truth, it sinks, it anchors. It will outlast her. I spoke with confidence I didn't entirely feel, because deep down, I knew Claire wasn't finished. And if she couldn't turn Margaret against me anymore, she might turn to something harsher, something we couldn't undo with evidence alone. The answer came one Friday afternoon. Margaret returned from work pale and trembling, holding a folded envelope that had been left in her office mailbox. Inside was a letter, typed this time, no cut-out words. If you don't throw him out, you'll lose more than your reputation. You'll lose everything. There was no signature, but it didn't need one. The tone was unmistakable. Margaret dropped the paper on the table as though it burned her fingers. "She's threatening me now," she whispered. "She's threatening both of us." Her voice cracked as she sank into a chair. "Patrick, what if she tries to hurt you?" I read the letter twice, my jaw tightening. This wasn't the reckless screaming of a daughter outside our door. This was deliberate, calculated. It wasn't just a smear campaign anymore, it was intimidation. She wanted Margaret afraid. She wanted her so shaken that she would abandon me just to make the fear. "Stop." I folded the letter carefully and set it aside. "Then it's time," I said. "We're done waiting. We're done hoping she'll stop. We take everything we have to the lawyer, and if that's not enough, to the police. She wants to play games with threats? Let her explain them under oath." Margaret looked at me with wide, wet eyes. She nodded, but I could see the grief still there. "She's my daughter," she whispered. "My only child." I placed my hands on her shoulders, steadying her. "And you're my wife, the woman I've built a life with. I won't let her destroy that, Margaret. Not now. Not ever." The very next morning, we drove into town together, the silver frame tucked carefully into a bag along with the external drive of recordings and the stack of forged documents Claire had left behind. The lawyer listened quietly as we laid everything out. He didn't flinch when we showed him the video clips or when Margaret explained the threats. When it was all done, he leaned back in his chair and said, "This isn't just family trouble anymore. This is fraud. This is harassment. And with the threats, it borders on criminal." He advised us to prepare for a formal case to document every call, every message, every letter. He even suggested filing for a restraining order if the threats escalated. Walking out of his office, Margaret clutched my arm tightly. "I never thought it would come to this," she murmured, "going against my own daughter in court." Her face was pale, but there was steel in her voice. She wasn't the same woman who had once doubted me over a folder of lies. She was harder now, forged in the fire of betrayal. That night back at home, I sat by the mantel where the silver frame still stood. I stared at it for a long time, remembering how I had placed it there as my last hope, never knowing it would become our greatest weapon. Margaret joined me, laying her head on my shoulder. "Do you think she'll stop if we take this to court?" she asked softly. I sighed, staring into the darkened room. "I think she'll fight harder. But in fighting, she'll bury herself. She's already lost the truth. All she has left are lies." Margaret's hand found mine, gripping tightly. "Then we face it together." For the first time since the night Claire had thrown me out of my own home, I felt something steady return to me. Control. I had walked away in silence, carrying only a suitcase and broken trust. But now I wasn't walking away. I was standing firm, and Margaret was standing with me. Whatever storm Claire brought next, she would find us ready, side by side, armed not with anger but with truth. And still, deep inside, I knew the final act was yet to come. Claire had threatened, lied, screamed, and schemed, but people like her never faded quietly into the background. She was planning something even bigger, something that would force the world to choose between her lies and our truth. And when that day came, we would have to decide how far we were willing to go to protect everything we had built. The house was quiet as Margaret drifted off to sleep beside me, but I stayed awake, staring at the ceiling. In my chest, I felt the steady drum of resolve. Claire thought she had taken everything from me once, but she had underestimated me then, and she was underestimating me now. The gift I left behind had already saved me once, and if need be, it would save me again. The final storm came sooner than either of us expected. It was a Sunday evening, the kind of quiet night when the streets were empty and the only sound was the ticking of the old clock in the hallway. Margaret and I were sitting in the living room when the phone rang. I answered, expecting another concerned friend or maybe the lawyer. But it wasn't a neighbor, and it wasn't legal advice. It was Claire. Her voice was different this time, low, sharp, almost trembling. "You think you've won," she hissed. "You think that stupid frame and those recordings mean anything. But you can't erase me, Patrick. You can't erase what I am to her. I'll always be her daughter. You'll always just be temporary." She spat the word like venom. I could hear her breathing, fast and uneven, on the other end of the line. Before I could answer, she added, "You'll see. Everyone will see. This isn't over." Then the call ended with a click. Margaret sat frozen, her face pale. "She won't stop," she whispered. And I knew she was right. Claire wasn't just lashing out anymore. She was consumed. Lies had become her only truth, and the more she clung to them, the deeper she sank. The next morning, as if to prove her words, a new rumor spread through the neighborhood. A neighbor arrived at our doorstep, hesitant but honest, to tell us Claire had been knocking on doors with a stack of her forged documents, insisting I had manipulated Margaret into changing her will. I felt the anger rise in me, but I kept my voice calm. "Let her spread her papers," I told Margaret, "because now we're not the only ones who have the truth." The lawyer had already begun preparing our case, compiling the recordings and the letters. If Claire wanted a war of documents, then so be it. We had the real ones, not the ones she scribbled in the dark. 2 weeks later, it all came to a head in a small conference room at the lawyer's office. Claire was there, red-eyed and defiant, her stack of papers clutched like a shield. Margaret sat beside me, her back straight, her hands trembling but firm. The lawyer placed the recordings on the table and pressed play. The room filled with the sound of Claire's own voice, muttering as she forged my signature, laughing bitterly as she slid the folder into my desk. Her eyes darted from the screen to her mother, but Margaret never looked away. When the recording ended, the room was silent except for Claire's shaky breathing. The lawyer cleared his throat. "This is more than just a family argument. These are deliberate acts of fraud and harassment. If you continue, Claire, you'll face consequences that go beyond this room." For the first time, I saw fear break through her anger. She tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. Margaret finally spoke, her voice quiet but steady. "Claire, I loved you more than anyone in this world. I gave you everything I could, and still, you tried to destroy the man who has stood by me for 25 years. You can't undo what you've done. You can only live with it." Claire's face crumbled. She shoved the papers into her bag and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. And just like that, it was over. Not with a confession, not with forgiveness, but with silence and absence. The weeks that followed were not easy. Margaret grieved as though she had lost her daughter completely, because in many ways, she had. I held her through long nights when the house felt too quiet, when memories of Claire as a child floated up like ghosts. But slowly, something began to grow in place of the pain. Trust. Real trust. Margaret no longer doubted me, no longer second-guessed the man she had chosen all those years ago. The lies that had poisoned her heart had been burned away, leaving only the truth. One evening, as we sat on the porch, watching the sun sink over the trees, Margaret leaned her head on my shoulder and whispered, "She thought she could take you away from me, but all she did was remind me of why I chose you." Her words broke something loose in me, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I let myself breathe. Our story wasn't perfect. We didn't get the neat, happy ending you find in storybooks. Families are messy, and betrayal leaves scars. But we had survived. We had faced lies, manipulation, and the kind of cruelty that tears households apart. And we were still standing. Together. And that, in the end, was more powerful than anything Claire had tried to destroy. So, if you've stayed with me until now, thank you for listening to this long and painful story. Betrayal can come from the people closest to you, and sometimes the ones you sacrifice the most for are the ones who turn their backs the fastest. But if this story has taught me anything, it's that truth has a way of finding its way to the surface, no matter how many lies try to bury it. If you found this story gripping, please take a moment to like this video. It really helps more people find these stories. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more true-to-life tales like this one. Stories filled with twists, betrayal, and lessons that stay with you long after they end. And I'd love to hear from you in the comment stories alive. Until the next one, remember this: lies may be loud, but truth lasts forever.